Great. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. We will be talking with a few really great panelists about why we think that zoning reform is necessary, or why they might think zoning reform is necessary. But on behalf of Desegregate Connecticut, I'm Sarah Bronin. Welcome. Just wanted to provide a brief agenda. We'll just have, I'll say 2 minutes of introductory remarks. We'll have the presentation, a discussion, and then we'll point you in the right direction for future next steps. A very quick introduction. So for those of you who haven't joined us before, who is Desegregate Connecticut? We are a group of neighbors and organizations who have come together because we really believe that land use laws in our state are outdated, and we think that they need to be reformed. Our coalition is very broad. I think there's a couple more members that have joined since we made this slide. So the updated list is at our website, but it's a very broad coalition of organizations focused on social justice, economic development, the environment, and just all really working hand in hand to try to make a better Connecticut. Just to emphasize that the purpose of our organization is to make change through legislation, working at the state capitol to convince legislators and the constituents who support them that the time is now for change. We're not a litigation-based organization, although others have taken that approach. As we discuss today, you might be interested in what our proposals are, and we'll just shoot this link over to you at www.desegregatect.com/platform. That provides you a list of the very basic elements of what we think are necessary for change. But with that, why are we interested in change? And that's really the question that we're talking about today. Well, we think there are 3 reasons. The first, and one that motivates many of us to participate in this effort at all, is equity and fixing the wrongs of the past, or at least starting to, and addressing the deep segregation that we see in our state. What we'll be talking about today is our second important reason, which is economy, economic development, an inclusive economy, inclusive growth through smart zoning that is really the start of a brighter future for Connecticut along a number of economic measures. And then finally, the environment, and we will have a discussion about the environment next week. If you want statistics, citations, studies, and so on, feel free to go again to our website. There's a page called Why Act. But today we're focused on the economic side of things. So our presenters today are Jenny Schuetz, Eric Santini, and Kevin Gremse. And I'm going to have them introduce themselves. And I think I'm starting with Eric. So I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen. And the way we're going to do it today is that each of the 3 panelists are going to spend about 5 minutes introducing themselves, talking about what their relationship is with the housing industry, and then maybe giving us a story or 2. They'll each introduce who they are, and then we'll get into some Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric. Eric, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sarah, thank you for inviting me. It was like a great panel. I am a builder developer out of Vernon and Ellington. It's a family business. My brother Kevin and I are running the day-to-day. My father founded the business over 50 years ago, and it's still involved. We build single family and multifamily. Right now we have 1,200 units under management that we've built and managed ourselves in the 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way up to a few years ago. I'm also the president of the Homebuilders and Remodelers Association of Connecticut, whose real goal is to advocate for housing industry issues at the Capitol. So happy to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Great. So we'll turn next to Kevin Gremse. I'm sorry for adding a syllable to your name. Kevin, would you like to just say some introductory remarks?
Sure. Hi, Sarah. I'm kind of used to Gremse. My wife calls me Gremse, so it's a term of affection. So, but it is pronounced Gremse. So, but I respond to both. So, Sarah, thank you for having me to be part of this panel. My name is Kevin Gremse. I'm with the National Development Council. NDC is a national nonprofit. We've been around for about 50 years. We work in about 80 communities around the country. I live in Connecticut, although actually most of my work is outside of Connecticut. And you know, my family's been asking me, well, why aren't you doing more work in Connecticut? And part of that reason is that some of the municipalities in Connecticut are slow to embrace development opportunities that are right smack in front of them, particularly in the downtowns. So I've worked with quite a few municipalities over the years. I work more so in New York, in the Long Island and Westchester County, where the development patterns are very similar. You don't have all that much development opportunities. So, and in Westchester County, Long Island, they have train stations and a good transit infrastructure. And there's a lot of land around that those train stations. And more municipalities are embracing the opportunity to maximize the land use and encourage downtown mixed use, mixed income, mixed type, walkable, transit-oriented development. So I usually get involved after they've gone through the, or NDC and me, we usually get involved after they've gone through the community engagement process, or updated their comprehensive master plan, or put together an overlay zone. And that sets the ground rules and the rules for engagement for the developers. And then our job is usually trying to figure out the financial capital stack challenge, because in many of these developments, it does require public investment. So from our experience, those that have gotten it right, those communities that have gotten it right have addressed the following. They've addressed site control. A lot of municipalities have site control, and it's so important for municipalities to offer that site control, oftentimes at a discounted amount or a contribution to the development. And what developers are really looking for is not only that site control, is predictability. Predictability on two fronts: land use approvals, as well as real estate taxes. So oftentimes we are right-sizing the real estate taxes, the abatement necessary for these developments to occur. And that's for both market rate housing and affordable housing, because for these larger scale developments, it's tough for it to pencil out. And then also the developers are looking for communities to help them on the infrastructure that are sometimes of a challenge. And most importantly, they're really looking for leadership among the elected officials, where they're embracing development opportunities, and they're going to be with them to support and the proposed developments that occur in the downtown. Again, for both mixed income, mixed use, and mixed type of housing. So I have a lot of examples to draw upon, but I think I'll stop and learn about our next panelist.
Great. Well, your comments provide a perfect segue into Jenny's presentation. And Jenny, you can go ahead and share your screen. I think you have a few slides for us. And because I think she's going to talk to us about some of these issues as she's studied them in Massachusetts. So I'll let her take it away.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And thanks for giving me a chance to come and talk to you, to your audience today. So this is really exciting. For those of you who've been paying attention to the news in Massachusetts, 2 weeks ago, the state legislature approved a new economic development bill that includes some provisions requiring communities that have a commuter rail station to create a multifamily zone. And actually in the fall, some colleagues and I put together a report that recommended something very similar to that. So the suburban areas in Massachusetts outside of Boston are really similar in a lot of ways to some of the Connecticut communities, to some of the places in Westchester that Kevin was talking about. So I wanted to show you kind of what the setup is in a lot of the Boston area suburbs, how the areas around transit stations can accommodate more housing, and what that has the potential to do for affordability. So the problem very much is that around a lot of the commuter rail stations, the land is currently occupied by really large lot single family homes. So there aren't that many homes within walking distance of stations. And under current zoning, that's the only thing that can be built, which means that there's just really not a lot of room for these places to grow. These are very expensive communities, very expensive homes. So that obviously has some equity implications, as Sarah said, and limiting the ability of people to use transit infrastructure that already exists is also clearly not helpful in moving forward on climate change. So what we recognize is that in Massachusetts, like in Connecticut, local governments have a really strong incentive to keep single family exclusive zoning, low density zoning, because that's what current voters and residents like. On the other hand, that's not helpful to the growth of the regional economy. That makes it very much more expensive for employers to hire and retain talent. So there's a strong state incentive to allow more development around the transit infrastructure. So what we did in our report was simulate what it would look like if Massachusetts allowed multifamily housing at moderate density within a half mile of commuter rail stations. And assuming that this would be by right, and so it really enables development with a pretty predictable process, which as Kevin said is really important. So what we found is that redeveloping single family homes, not even doing large scale development, but just converting single family homes into denser development has some real affordability gains. So to show you what this looks like, these are a couple of houses within about 2 blocks of the Wellesley Hills train station. For those of you who are familiar with the Boston area, this is one of the most affluent suburbs west of Boston. It's on a commuter rail line that gets you into downtown within half an hour. Much of the land is locked up, as you see, in these large single family homes on very large lots. The average lot size within a half mile of the station is over half an acre. So there's really a lot of land to work with. And what we modeled is what you could do with those lots if developers were allowed to build multifamily. And we gamed out 2 scenarios, one of them being townhouses and the other being multifamily up to about 20 units an acre. So moderate density, but still lower than what you would have in the urban core. And you can see in the bottom here, for a community like Wellesley, where the average lot size is over half an acre, you could easily fit 5 side-by-side townhouses, including parking pads if you wanted to, or about 11 or 12 condos in a low-rise multifamily building. So we're still keeping very much within sort of the low-rise context here. But that accommodates really a substantial amount more housing just on a single family lot without needing to do land assembly. Because the land is so expensive in these communities, the cost of the home is really driven by how much land you have per house. So developing a new single family house would cost about $2 million, of which about $800,000 is just the land by itself. So you can imagine that sharing these land costs over more housing units just by increasing the number of units per parcel brings down the per unit housing cost by quite a lot. So the scenario that I was showing you, if you can build an 11 or 12 unit condo building on one of those lots, developers would be able to sell those condos for about $500,000 a piece. You get really substantial cost savings by going to higher density units. And we've got lots more details of this. I think Sarah's linked to the report on the Desegregate Connecticut website, so you can take a look. But I think the lessons here would apply very broadly to many of the Connecticut suburbs around these rail stations. So we see this as a relatively light touch way of adding density, adding housing, improving affordability, but really with a driver coming at the state level to provide this predictability so all of the communities have a very similar development environment.
Great. And so, with these 3 perspectives in mind, a builder, development professional, a researcher, I think you can see a few key themes. And I guess I'll just throw it out to, maybe we'll start with Kevin first. So you talked about exclusive zoning or zoning being predictable. Can you say a little more about the kinds of things that the towns you've worked with, I know you've worked in New Rochelle, have done to make zoning more predictable? Is it the process? Is it the number of units? What have they done, more specifically to try to add predictability? Then we'll turn to Jenny.
I think in most instances in which I've worked in communities such as the city of New Rochelle, a larger, a larger city that has embraced development and a substantial density there, where their units or buildings can be approved up to 46 stories, to smaller communities, whether it be a larger city or a smaller community. They have started with a community visioning process, and that community visioning process gets incorporated into an overlay and new zoning for downtowns in terms of what the community really wants to see downtown as a means of activating and breathing life into the downtown. So an example of a smaller community is a village of New Rochelle, a village of Mount Kisco in Westchester County. It's a smaller village that only has 12,000 residents. And whether it be a small community such as Mount Kisco or a larger city such as city of New Rochelle, they've started with an asset-based approach to development, where they're recognizing that they have infrastructure downtown and they have land and they have an asset, particularly the train station, that creates a base where developers want to provide and be responsive to the marketplace. The marketplace for rental housing, the marketplace for not only market rate rental housing, but affordable rental housing. So in most of the cases in which I've worked where there's been larger scale transformation with residential development downtown, it has included both, included both market rate housing and affordable housing. And they haven't, and they've been done, they've been done on an integrated basis, whereby there is a set aside for affordable housing, whether it be 10 or 20%, or if it's 100% affordable, it's there are incentives and to provide a level of predictability for the developers to do that. So in the case of Mount Kisco, again, it's a smaller community, mostly a New York City suburb where many of the residents are commuting into New York City. So they had 12 acres that was surface parking lot, and they wanted to exchange the surface parking lot for rental housing. So they knew that they had to update their comprehensive development plan, and they established an overlay zone. And they recognized that the existing zoning didn't work for the type of development that they wanted to do, namely mixed use, mixed income, walkable development. So the community planning principles that they established were to activate the downtown, preserve the contextual scale. So they were going to embrace density, but not at the expense of losing the character of the downtown. So what they approved is 4 stories rather than 2 stories, improve the transportation and the access to the train station, maintain sufficient parking. So they required a 1-to-1 replacement of that surface parking with structured parking. Now that creates a whole new financial challenge, which I can address later. But they didn't want to eliminate the public parking for both the commuters and the retail-based downtown. They wanted to upgrade the public realm so that there's a lot of civic improvements that was encouraged when they put out the request for proposal. And then they also were very sensitive to the impact onto the environment. So they required a developer to implement a floodplain management system as part of the development. So all of that was incorporated into a request for proposal after they updated their and established their overlay zone. And the response from the development community was very, very good. So we worked to help the village select the developer and put together a public incentive package that allowed them to make financial sense out of this proposed development. So for that development, like so many others, in order to address the issue, it gets back to that predictability. The predictability was there based upon the overlay zone already being established, and that was incorporated into the request for proposal. Predictability with real estate taxes, that's a really important part, because real estate taxes is one of the, in Connecticut, as is the case in Westchester County and Long Island, it's a big impediment for the financing to work. So you have to provide or establish a willingness to provide some level of abatement on the taxes.
So let me turn to Jenny. Oh, did you have one more thing? I was just going to ask her about.
Yeah, and I'd wrap up is that in the case of Mount Kisco and in the case of Town of Babylon and New Rochelle, it was also about the underscoring of the leadership of the elected officials of saying, this is what we want in our downtown. This is good for the downtown as a means of breathing that life into the downtown. So that leadership is really critical in all the instances in which I've worked.
Great. So Jenny, in the Massachusetts example, in these new TOD districts, I think the permitting is going to be as of right within that half mile or some version of that. What are your thoughts on the mechanics of that? For example, here in Connecticut, we're looking at promoting a statewide model form-based code that can provide architectural criteria for that kind of predictability. But give us your thoughts about this concept of predictability and how it might manifest itself in the Massachusetts TOD areas.
Sure. Yeah, no, the predictability of the process is just really essential. A lot of the soft costs of development are driven by the length of time that the process takes and how difficult it is and how many sort of revisions to the plan that are involved with that. So the proposal that we made in our report was to allow by right development, so set a density that was going to be comparable around all of the stations, and then within that allow it by right and essentially be able to override some of the procedural hurdles that local governments have used. I will say that one of the issues that we punted on a little bit is that a lot of places in suburban Boston have historic districts. And so many of the commuter rail stations are actually in sort of a historic Main Street area, and overriding historic preservation to do new development is a whole other issue that's outside of the zoning. So it is an extra level of complexity. But this idea that you should be able to, the community should go through a community visioning process, agree what they're comfortable with, both in the mix of uses, in the density, in some sort of architectural guidelines, but to do that up front and then have that written into the statute such a way that the developer knows what they're allowed to build and they can just go through with it, right? So my experience is that developers play by the rules that are laid out, and the more clear rules there are, the easier it is to plan for it and to work with that. It's the unpredictability and the shifting nature, sort of ad hoc. Sometimes you get approval and sometimes you don't. That's what really makes it difficult, and that all adds to the cost. So, the cost numbers that we were showing you are assuming that development of these projects can happen in about 3 years, because this is something that doesn't require an extensive ongoing revision through the community engagement process. I understand that writing into state statute ways to get around a lot of the discretionary review process is not necessarily that simple. Sorry, that's my dog Trooper. But the more that the state statute can create this sort of by right predictability, it's also really important to have predictability across jurisdictions, so that an area around the train station goes through the same process and is subject to relatively sort of the same level of review, regardless of which jurisdiction you're working in.
Great. Thank you. And Eric, I'm going to turn it back over to you to say, from the perspective of somebody who has to go out and get those approvals for every one of your projects. How do you see this question of predictability? Is it, do you agree that let's get community input in advance and then permit at the end, and just have it go through a zoning administrative review or something along those lines? I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts, and maybe a project or two that you've worked on in Connecticut that has been maybe gone through a good process, or maybe gone through a less helpful process from your perspective.
Sure. Yeah, predictability is extremely important. I can give you an example of a town that we're working in now that we're going through, trying to get an approval for 240 low density townhome units. It's actually right next to I-84, and within walking distance of existing retail. And the town is actually hired because this is a town that's not used to having multifamily. They haven't had a new multifamily development in probably over 15 years. They actually hired a consultant to help with the process and help us with the process of getting it approved. The town sees a value in having something transit oriented where you're right next to I-84. The infrastructure in this town does not expand throughout the town, so it's right there. And it would help the existing retail that's right next to it. So it's a win-win for the town. And they would be a town that's doing it the right way. We haven't dealt with them on the real estate taxes, but the real estate taxes are really important too, as far as predictability. Ultimately, a developer has to get this financed, and then they're going to have to get permanent lending at the end. So that really plays in a lot of how much financing they're actually going to get. So predictability on that front is really important. We've also just had a bad experience in a town that really most of our portfolio is in. We've got a long history of building in this town. We proposed a 56 unit townhome development, low density, next to our existing multifamily and high density single family. We had to get a zone change from high density single family, went in for a zone change and went through the town traffic authority, went through multiple pre-application hearings with our meetings with the staff. They seemed to all be on board. Very few comments from the staff on the project. Gave a 2-hour presentation to the Planning and Zoning Commission, and lost 7-0 because they felt that was the wrong area for multifamily. Even though it had all the utilities, the road was actually just rebuilt, had gas, everything. And really, what happened in that case was the Planning and Zoning Commission just sort of got bullied by one resident that really organized 40 other residents on a Zoom call and a Zoom public hearing, which is a challenge in itself. And we were frankly fairly surprised. This is really fit right into the community. Low density multifamily to high density single family shouldn't be that much of a transition. And that was a case where the town really didn't give the appropriate predictability that a developer is looking for. I mean, if the town staff kind of leads you along saying everything looks great, and then you get into the public hearing and really don't have their support, it's a disappointment. So it can certainly go both ways.
Great, thank you for that. Thank you for that example. So Kevin had given some advice to public officials thinking about diverse housing types, or thinking about different types of housing or different kinds of development coming into their communities. Eric, you talked about perhaps this public sentiment or kind of emerging at times, but perhaps not necessarily representing the whole. What advice or what thoughts might you have for public officials as they navigate these questions of zoning and zoning reform? How should they look at it, and what are the economics for them in terms of what are the kinds of things they should be thinking about? Jenny, I'll turn it over to you perhaps to think about this, because you've just had this successful passage of this. I mean, the bill passed in Massachusetts, local legislators, three no votes, and both houses otherwise unanimous. But tell us how you think they thought of this issue.
Yeah, I would say that one of the reasons why we think that statewide action on this is helpful is that it provides cover, in a sense, for local staff. So it's really difficult for planning commissions at the local level to stand in front of their voters, their homeowners, and push for something that maybe a small but vocal minority wants. So in some sense, the statewide policy change provides cover to mayors and city councils at the local level who know that they need to provide for growth, who know that they need to provide housing that's available to a workforce at a wider range of incomes than are currently available. But the local politics are just very hard. And so the state can provide cover to that. So there definitely are some local governments that would like to provide a broader range of housing options, but maybe haven't made the case to their voters, or there's a question of sort of where do you put it, right? So we need to have multifamily somewhere, we need to have townhouses somewhere. I think the better way to frame this for local officials is not, do we grow, but where do we grow and how do we grow? And so that's a more positive framing of this issue. And again, there are a number of different ways. So either something like a statewide zoning around transit stations, something like the other Massachusetts tool 40B, where there's sort of targets that each community has to provide a certain amount of affordable housing or potentially higher density housing. And then the community has a chance to decide where to do this and how to implement it, but the ultimate goal is already determined. It's tough for local governments. I live in Washington, D.C. Our mayor has been pushing very hard to expand housing supply. We've also not been growing enough to accommodate job growth and population growth. And for local officials, they have to put some of their political capital behind this. That's risky. That may cost them some votes in the upcoming election. But ultimately, this is really important for the economic well-being, and it's really important for the people who don't have as much of a voice in the local process. And I think ultimately that's what we count on our elected officials to do, that they're responsible for the entire community's well-being and not just for the homeowners who make the most noise.
Yeah, Eric, from your perspective, I know that the home builders and remodelers have done a study with the National Association of Home Builders about the impacts on local governments in tax revenues. Did you want to talk a little bit about that, or?
Sure. Sure. So NAHB actually did a study on a proposed 414 unit apartment project in Middletown. So they took a lot of they took a lot of things into they factored a lot of things, including the area, the population, the economics of the area. And really, they kind of looked at two main things. One is really the direct payoff for the local government. So in this case, obviously with every new development, the town's going to be burdened with maybe having to put up some infrastructure costs, relating to schools, roads, utilities. So in their 1 year build out scenario, they were looking at a deficit to the town in year one of that build out. And then after that, it was a operating surplus really for the town infinitely. In this case, it'd be a $2 million. And they would be able to pay off any kind of capital improvement they'd have to do to support this project in year two. So the economics are there. They also looked at something that's really important, is the ripple effect of projects like this. When a town doesn't have new construction or any kind of new construction, it kind of loses that vibrancy of that economic development. The numbers on a project like the 414 units, they looked at $50 million of revenue generated by that project throughout, with a ripple effect, including where the workers are going to eat lunch, where they're getting to service their cars, where they buying insurance, wherever. And that was in year one and at a gain of about 629 jobs. So that's not just including what's on that construction site, but all the services that support that. And then once you have residents actually moving into this 414 unit, I think they were looking at something like a $2 million, about $15 million of local income annually. And then another $3.5 million of income in taxes and fees. So these are tremendous economic drivers here that really can help these towns. And I think what we're seeing in Talon County is we're seeing some towns that are actually, for the first time, sort of interested in this. They realize their grand lists aren't really going anywhere, haven't gone anywhere for years. And this is a way to actually reinvigorate their existing businesses, their local businesses in town, and also give a more diversified, kind of a more diversified housing within their towns to really accommodate the demand.
Great. Thank you for that. There's a couple of questions in the chat about the balance between local authority to draft regulations. So let's say our state did something similar to what Massachusetts did, and said, okay, within a half mile, which is, one of our proposals, so we hope they do something similar, but within a half mile of a train station, the town has to zone some percentage, we're suggesting 50% of the land, for multifamily housing as of right, in the way that we've discussed it. If we do that, to what extent should towns or would towns have the ability to draft architectural standards? And so this is a balance, I think, where the state gives a general guidance, and the local government, at least in our view, would be able to articulate those same kinds of architectural standards that we've been talking about. Kevin, where have you seen that kind of balance before, where you have maybe a state goal or state guidelines balanced against local authority, or where have you seen local governments take it upon themselves to develop architectural standards that will help to achieve these broader goals that we're recognizing need to be addressed in the state? I think you're on mute. Kevin?
Okay,
There you are.
I'm on. Well, in one instance in the town of Babylon, they wanted to encourage a transit-oriented development, mixed income, mixed use on land that had been surface parking. And they went ahead and established their own overlay zone and form-based code. And then they hired their own architect that was retained to review all the proposed development within that zone. And those guidelines, some of the developers that were responsive to the request for proposal, they were taken aback by it, but the town wanted to make sure that there was housing that was not only affordable, but market rate housing, to have a blend of market rate and affordable housing and have the same design standards for the both. And then also underscore the fact that there was financial incentives that the town was willing to provide in the form of real estate tax abatement and direct financial participation to make economic sense out of it, because the design standards were higher than what the developers were expecting, because it was a very low income census tract, a very low income community, and the town wanted to reinforce the fact that we were looking for quality design with quality building materials. So that elevated the cost a little bit, but we're able to put together a capital structure that offset that cost. The other issue is what's the level of affordability that you're going to provide. So a lot of communities are encouraging a 10% set aside for developments that exceed 10 units or more. But it's fine to encourage an affordable set aside to have a mixed income product, but you also have to address the financial challenges for that affordable set aside and offer some level of guidance to the developers in terms of how you offset that affordable set aside in terms of financial resources that are available.
Yeah, that's a great point. And part of our proposals for TOD and for Main Street zoning, which is zoning for 2 to 4 family units around Main Street, says that exactly that. For 10 or more units, should be a 10% of the units should be affordable. I think you're absolutely right that the counterpart to zoning reform has to be some kind of program that helps those units and those larger buildings get produced, where the towns start to allow it. So that's something that's needs to be thought of as a complement. You brought something up, and I didn't jot it down, so oh, Jenny, Jenny, do you want to talk a little bit more about affordability and the process that you dropped a link in the chat about LA. LA has been in the news a little bit recently. We actually sent out an article last week in our mailing list about accessory dwelling units, which we're not talking so much about today, but how in 3 years of more legalizing ADUs in Los Angeles, they increased 11 times. I think this is a different article though, and I'd love for you to just maybe let us know what it said in the one in the chat.
Sure. Yeah, no, California has been experimenting a lot, so I think there's some lessons we can draw. The LA Times article that I just circulated, the link, that's following a specific proposed affordable project in one of the Orange County suburbs. California has an incredibly long and complicated approval process, both with the local requirements and then also the overlay of the State Environmental Quality Act, which really creates a lot of venues to push back on developments. The interaction of these two makes the development process really long. So the Times did a great profile of this one project that has been on the proposal in the entitlement process for over a decade now, and the costs just keep going up, in part because construction costs are going up. So labor costs, material costs have been rising. So the longer you wait to build, the more expensive it is. But also every single time the project gets revised, the developer has to go back and incur costs to change it, right? So I think what often we don't take into account is when the neighbors say, I don't want this type of external materials, or I want different lighting or different design, that requires the architectural and engineering team to go back and redo their plans. And that's a direct cost to the developer, right? So all of that gets built into the final cost of the product. And the cost of financing, the carrying costs continue to add up. And so, the longer the process, the more expensive the final product needs to be. I will say a better sort of lesson to take from California, they've spent a long time figuring out how to make ADUs actually feasible to develop. So for homeowners who have space on their lot and want to build this, and the state has gone through a couple rounds of legislation. The first couple of them sort of legalized ADUs in theory, but nothing actually got built. And they realized that after a while, they had to change some of the requirements. Sometimes this involves changing things like the requirements for water and sewer hookup. So if you have to upgrade from a single family to a 2-family for the water provision, that becomes more expensive to do. And so I think that, a lesson for both local and state governments is to remember sort of write the initial legislation, but anticipate that there may be some hitches that you haven't thought of. Pay attention to whether or not you're seeing early indications of the kinds of outcomes you'd expect. And if not, go looking for what the hitches are. So it's very hard to write this sort of legislation and get everything right the first time. A better approach is write something that you think tackles the biggest problems, see how well it works, and then fine tune it over time. There have been a couple of comments that local governments will have different circumstances. Some of them have capacity of water and sewer. Some of them are going to have potentially school capacity. So all of those things are going to be hard to get right the first time. Think about sort of the broad framework and then make sure that there's enough kind of flexibility to be able to work with the local situation.
Great. And Eric, did you have anything to add on that point, or about the point of affordability?
I think I'd go back to I think Jenny made some good points as far as the process of going through. I mean, when a builder is going and budgeting for the project and having to submit to a lending institution to get that construction loan, they really need to have some sort of certainty about what their standards are and really go in knowing that things aren't going to change dramatically as they go through the process. So that's really important. And then of course, time. The timer's running as soon as you start one of these. As soon as you get that application going, you're paying attorneys, soil scientists, engineers. So that just keeps going, and as the months go, it just gets worse. So that's really important. I also like Jenny's point of flexibility. You come up with these regulations and with the best intentions, and you want to get that outcome. But you've got to be willing to be a little bit flexible as far as, hey, maybe this isn't exactly what we want. Maybe we want to allow this kind of development. And I think towns that are a little bit more open-minded will be the ones that actually can attract some of these developments that are close to transit and where they want it to be in the center of town. So I wholeheartedly agree with both her points.
Great. I wanted to just, there's some questions about, at what point do we have local control? And I think I think it sounds like what everybody seems to be saying on this call anyway is, maybe the local control happens at the beginning of the process rather than at the end. I hope you can see my screen. This is a summary chart of that National Homebuilders report. It's something that we've shown in other presentations, but since it's come up so often, I decided to just grab it for this slide. And this is for new multifamily housing, and they have separate analysis for new single family housing, but 1,500 units providing these kinds of impacts is pretty impressive. But I think, you know, the question that, you know, some have raised in the chat and you know, as we discussed is, you know, to what extent does, you know, why state action? Why are we looking at sort of state guidelines? I think there's some things that have been addressed. The politics of it at the local level is often difficult. Inertia, you know, not maybe a lack of understanding by local decision makers about the big picture. And I just wanted to show you a couple of images from our zoning atlas as we continue the conversation for the next 10 to 12 minutes or so. Our zoning atlas is a project that has not been released to the public yet, but we do have a couple of images of it that I can show you so far. We're still going through beta testing and so on. This is an image that shows you where in Connecticut single family housing is allowed as of right. And by as of right, we mean similar to what was said before, does not require a public hearing, does not require a variance or a rezoning or anything else. This is where you can go to the zoning office, say I'm building a single family house, and then it gets approved. Does anybody want to guess what this map shows? It shows where 4-family housing is allowed as of right. There are a couple of small towns which allow 4-family housing to go over the counter, and probably that's, you know, because they have lots of space and you know, happy to approve, you know, appropriate projects. But let me just go back to this other slide: single family housing and 4-family housing. And you can just really see that there's a stark difference, obviously, in the way that that we permit housing. Now, our proposals are not saying that 4-family housing needs to be permitted as of right across Connecticut, you know, by any means. Our proposals really focus on those areas where development already occurs and says to local governments, you know, here are the spots that if you permit those housing types as of right, you'll really get a lot of benefits. It's concentrated in areas where there is infrastructure already. And you know, we know that there are tangible benefits even to local government revenues that you can produce. I'll show you one more slide, a couple more slides maybe, and just to kind of clarify what it is we're proposing. Our transit-oriented development proposal is about this half-mile radius and train stations. This might be a lot of text, but again, it's on our platform page. 50% should be zoned multifamily or mixed-use development, basically at least 4-family development. We've worked with towns to come up with an addition to that, which is that within half of that obligation can be met on a contiguous public road within 1 mile of the train station. But here's Milford, that just gives you an example. Milford, and the purple is where 4-family is permitted. Milford is one of those places that, you know, looks like it's pretty close to satisfying the 4-family requirement within the TOD. Now, lots of Connecticut communities within the half-mile of a train station are not, but this is just one example. Again, our suggestion is 10% affordable housing for 10 or more units, excluding roads, wetlands, trap block ledges, and sensitive lands. And then similarly, our Main Street proposal, you know, again, very similar, within a quarter mile, I should say length really, of a main street. So within a quarter mile of a main street, half of that should be zoned for as of right 2 to 4-family or multifamily homes, again, if the town decides. And this is, you know, back to that point, it's the town that decides where the 50% is, what the architectural types are, you know, just within the state would give very basic parameters, and it's the town that would, you know, go through and try to work through their permitting process. Again, though, hoping for that 10% affordable housing for 10 or more units. So maybe I'll just pause there and ask the panelists, you know, if reactions or thoughts. I mean, the other issue that we didn't talk about much was parking. And, you know, in both of these proposals, we would say, you know, maybe parking is not required in these areas. And so how have you found that parking requirements, you know, might add to this? I mean, I'll just throw it open for any comments. Comparisons to Massachusetts again.
Yeah, so I'll actually bring in some of the TOD developments that have been done in the DC area. Arlington County, Virginia is a good example of a place that decided to do a lot of density, very concentrated around the metro stations when that came in, and then keep a lot of land that's still zoned for single family, really about a half mile from the station areas. And so they accommodated an enormous amount of growth while keeping the single family neighborhoods the same. There are some other parts of the region that went to more of this sort of middle density or gentle density, and have a lot of, say, 3-story townhomes, duplexes and so forth, but did not go to sort of the taller towers around train stations. So I think it's a good example of just there are different ways to accommodate growth, and communities can kind of decide if there's sort of an area that makes sense to double up on the density, that has better access to water and sewer, for instance, that can work. We've seen actually a couple of the recent developments close to metro stations, the Wharf and Navy Yards. The new multifamily has parking garages underneath, and the residents actually have to sign an agreement with their lease that they will not use street parking. So to make sure, so that if they want to have a car, they have to keep it in the garage. And many people actually choose not to, because of course the advantage of living right next to a train station is that you don't need it. And so car usage has been much lower among communities that are within walking distance of the rail stations. You know, I think tying to your sort of third goal of environment, the benefit of building housing on top of train stations is it allows people not to have a car or not to use a car as much. We're seeing increasingly developers who don't want to build additional parking because especially younger households don't want to own a car. They may rely on Uber and Lyft to get around when they need it. But developers are worried about building parking that's going to wind up just sitting empty as car ownership drops among these households. That's a really expensive investment. And once it's there, it's very hard to convert to something else.
Great. Other comments? Kevin? Looks like you had.
Yeah, I think your point is a good one, Sarah. It's guidance. It's not prescriptive for the individual municipalities to consider of what you're suggesting, because there's still choices within the state zoning guidance that you're establishing. So I think that's one important element, is that it's not overly prescriptive. There's still some level of local decision making relative to that guidance, but the guidance is needed. With respect to parking, certainly we want to encourage municipalities to reduce the parking requirements of a development that is close to transit. So you typically see 1.5 spaces per unit, but we want to look at allowances for lower parking requirements to support the residential development. That being said, if you're taking away what has been made available as public parking, there's usually municipalities are looking to replace that on a one-to-one basis, and you have to look at a way in which the development could support the cost of structured parking, which typically is $35,000 to $30,000 per space or more. So that creates a financial challenge that we need to be aware of.
Great. And Eric, any last closing comments before we do our short wrap up?
I think actually just on this last point here, the 10% affordable requirement, I think it would be, once again, we get back to certainty for the developer. We'd want to know how that would be financed, and would that be up to the municipality through a density bonus or tax abatement? I think that's going to be an important thing to attract a developer. They're going to want to know, how do I achieve that? To wrap up, I would just say, I think, it's important to have a diversity of housing options. I think, obviously New England's very traditional. We love our 1-acre lots, and certainly there is a place for those. But I think, time changes things. The idea of apartments and multifamily and what people expect from it have changed dramatically. Lifestyles have changed with the generations. And I think we need in Connecticut, I think we owe it to ourselves to be able to offer that variety of housing to our citizens. I think, you know, right now a lot of the towns have been kind of stuck in their kind of dated multifamily zoning that really isn't attractive for developers, or towns have limited maybe their expansion of utilities. So I think, you know, we have to open our minds a little bit to the changing demographics, the changing lifestyles, and really open up opportunities for a more diversified housing.
And actually, if I can jump in on that point, one thing that we haven't talked about so far is the benefits of doing some multifamily housing that's oriented towards seniors. So there are a lot of older people who are living in single family houses, many of them that are multi-level, that have stairs involved, that have pretty high maintenance costs. And we know that as more people age, they want to stay in the neighborhood and the community where they've been. But a lot of the places where people live now don't have elevator housing, don't have accessible housing for people to move into. And one of the real benefits to communities is the idea of creating perhaps some senior housing in the neighborhood that architecturally fits in and that's designed and that allows people to age in their community without having to essentially maintain the costs and the physical demands of doing this large single family maintenance. So that's, you know, AARP has been very supportive of ADUs, which can allow family members or caretakers to move in. So I think, you know, thinking about sort of both ends of the age spectrum, there's some real advantages to doing diversity of housing types.
Great. And I think that's and by the way, you know, if anybody on the AARP in Connecticut is on this call, we'd love to talk more with you about the proposals that they've shaped up. You know, we think that they are good. You know, these kinds of things are good for seniors. And again, the ADUs as of right would be one of the big ones, but also just the creation of more housing in general. Okay, so, you know, just to flag that there's a take action page on our website if you're interested in learning more, doing more, talking with your legislators, joining our coalition as an organization, writing a letter, making public comments at your local meetings, and so on. And there is AICP and AIA credit available. And if you need help with that, be sure to contact us and we will leave it at that. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to our excellent panelists. And we'll hope to hear you guys, hear your comments, thoughts, and feedback in the future. So thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.